Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello, and welcome back to a very special Pride edition of Out with Dan. Today, I'm excited to talk to Kevin Christopher Snipes about Never Let Me Go. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much. I am just particularly excited about this book. This book came to me through your publicist, and I remember thinking, okay, a rom-com, and it is, it's Pride Month. Let's go for a rom-com. And with rom-coms, they're typically predictable. I'm not trying to be unkind, but it's usually a meet, a breakup, and a get back together type of situation. So that's what I had in mind when I was coming into this, but it is certainly not what you served up to us so wonderfully. Will you give the audience an overview about what your book is about?
Sure, absolutely. So Don't Let Me Go is the story of Riley and Jackson, two teenage boys in Florida who find themselves inexplicably drawn to each other when they meet by chance one summer. And as their relationship progresses and as they get closer, they start to experience these visions of what appear to be past lives that they seem to have shared with one another. And in these past lives, the boys are always in love, but they also always sort of die tragically at the end of their lives. And this leads Riley and Jackson to suspect that they're soulmates who are trapped in this endless cycle of death and reincarnation. And the boys then have to decide whether it's worth being together if their love seems certain to doom them for all eternity.
I will tell you, I thought the premise was just absolutely wonderful. And as I said, the delivery was over the top. So what drew you to this particular story to tell?
It's a bit of a long story, so fasten your seatbelt.
Bring it on.
To give you the quick version of it. So a few years ago, I watched this documentary about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Pompeii in 79 CE. And it's such a heartbreaking story. And for people who don't know what happened, I'll give the quick version of events is that at the height of the Roman Empire, there was this city built at the base of a volcano. They didn't know it was a volcano at the time. That's why they built the city there. But one day, as I said, in 79 CE, this volcano erupted, catching everyone by surprise. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people were killed over the course of a few hours. And the city itself was completely buried under just sort of layers and layers of ash and soot, and just, it was completely frozen in time and buried and preserved for about almost 2,000 years until archaeologists in the last century decided to start excavating it. And when they did, they found this almost perfectly preserved city. There were houses preserved, there was artwork preserved, and they also found the positions of people's bodies and where they were and what they were doing in their moment of death. And the archaeologists took made these plaster sculptures of the bodies. And if you go online, you can see them. They're incredibly beautiful, incredibly haunting. Some of these bodies are, in a fetal position. And some of these bodies are holding on to each other and clutching each other in their final moments of life. And I thought that was such a beautiful, powerful image of just sort of two people knowing they're going to die, but like holding on to each other. And after watching this documentary, in the back of my mind, I had this thought of like, oh, I wonder how many people who died in Pompeii that day were queer, or what we would recognize as queer. Obviously, the Romans had a different conception of sexuality than we do, but like, how many of those people who died were in same-sex relationships, or, and as statistically, there had to be some. That's just math.
Of course.
We would never know for sure. And that got me thinking of like all the queer stories throughout history that we would never know, either because they couldn't be open and tell their stories, or because the history books deliberately censored those stories.
That's right.
And so I wanted to write a book that managed to restore queer people and queer love to the historical narrative. And I thought the idea of a reincarnation story would be a great way to do that, because it allowed me, through Riley and Jackson and their past lives, to go to different eras and different countries and sort of show how queer people have always existed and how there will always exist. And that was kind of my way of just sort of celebrating a history that we're not really taught about in schools or anywhere else.
Well, and I agree. My friend Rob Osler wrote a book recently called The Missing Maid. I have a feeling I've screwed up the title, but anyway, and it's set in the late 1800s, and there just aren't any accounts of queer people during that time. And I think, we see it in today, sadly, that there's always a lot of rewriting of history or trying to erase people. That was one of the things that I found so heartening about this book. I know that, so I'm a believer in reincarnation. I know not everyone is. I respect the lane everyone's in, but I personally believe in reincarnation. I find sometimes I meet someone and I feel as if I've known them my entire life, but I just met them 5 minutes ago. For me, that's an indication of trust from something internal that I say, okay, there's a reason I instantly trust this person, or the opposite is I instantly distrust this person, and there's a reason for that as well. And so for me, reading any kind of story that I think is both about reincarnation and metaphysics always speaks to me because I get something positive from it. And I think that's something that you did so well in bringing about a positivity on a dark plane, a dark source. So the boys they keep coming back, and they keep sort of reliving a particular moment in their young adult life, and they keep dying together. And so what about that? What about the darkness appealed to you?
It's, earlier you mentioned that in YA as a genre, it tends to be very, it tends to follow a formula, and it's a great formula. And for people, and like you said, like I think stories that follow that formula and have a happy ending are great. And we need queer joy, and we need queer happiness, and we need those stories where everything turns out great for everyone, especially in dark times.
Yes.
At the same time, I'm more of a realist. I'm much more practical, and I think it's also important to prepare people for the reality of the world. And I think sometimes when there's such an emphasis on 100% queer joy, it can kind of be like we're gaslighting the younger generation that we've solved all the problems and that they're inheriting a world free of bias and free of prejudice. And so in all of my work, I always try to balance queer joy with the queer practicality of sometimes it's going to be hard. And sometimes you're going to have to overcome obstacles. And it's important to be aware that these obstacles exist so that when you hit them, you're prepared for them and you can overcome them. Because if we think we're just inheriting a world where there's no problems and everybody loves us, then it's going for a rude awakening.
Yes. And we won't be prepared. We won't have the tools in our toolbox to deal with that crossroads when we get to it. And that's one of the things. So we talked a little bit before recording, and I rarely do a comparison, but there were some comparisons I felt here to Adam Silvera's writing.
Yeah,
he deals with some very specific subjects. You deal with some of these subjects sort of the same way. There is an end of life for all of us at some point, and yet you did it so masterfully.
Well, yeah, thank you. I've always been a huge fan of Adam's work. I mean, I think the very second YA book I ever read was More Happy Than Not, and the very third YA book I ever read was They Both Die at the End. So I think reading those books early on in my writing development certainly had an influence on my own writing. And I love speculative fiction. I love fiction that allows you to go a little darker, make the world a little weirder, do some stranger things, mix things up, keep things interesting. So yeah, I love Adam's work, and I think the book has shades of this, of Adam. Yes, this book would not exist if Adam's work had not come before it. Absolutely.
Oh, that's a very nice homage. A nice thing to say. So It's so one of the things I always make notes when I interview people, because I'm not going to rely on my mind to remember everything. But there is something about the characters that you do which I love, is you, while they look alike, they, not all the characters and all the lives match up exactly.
Mhm.
Sometimes one needs saving, sometimes the other needs saving, and I almost hesitate to use the word saving, but I think that's sort of what you gave us, in the fact that one's a little more confident than the other in different ways in different lives. And you want to speak about that? What was important
Sure.
about that?
Well, I think one of the things that makes a great dynamic and a great relationship is seeing how the other person is there for the other person. Like what are they both sort of contributing to the relationship, and what are they providing that the other person needs? And so, even just if you just look at the Riley Jackson story in the present, both of those boys, they're each providing something that the other person needs, and that's why they fall in love. And then I sort of echoed that throughout their past lives of, sometimes, yes, sometimes one of them is more physically strong, sometimes one of them is more intellectually strong. There's always this balance, and they're always sort of looking out for each other, using whatever skills they happen to have in that past life, whether it's Rorik's singing voice in the Viking chapter, or you know, or the physical strength, Gaspard's physical strength in the Paris chapter, their cunning in the London chapter. So yeah, I wanted to always have the boys. I think that makes you root for them, and it makes you see why they work as a couple, because you're like,
Yes.
oh, these boys cannot exist without each other. And I think that also helps explain the ending a bit more, of like, these boys on their own would be a miserable disaster. They need each other in each other's lives for their lives to have any meaning, or for their lives to work. So yeah.
And I love that. I did really like the timelines you chose. I did not know about the Bartholomew massacre. I did not know about that. I thought, when I first got to it, I thought it was going to be Mary Queen of Scots was going to figure into it, but it's close to the same era, but not the same era. But I was really surprised at some of these things in our past history that you brought into. So do you have one? Is there one era other than Orlando that might be your favorite?
You know, I I picked periods of history that I love learning about history. Big history nerd. So I mean, I obviously Pompeii, the Roman era. I mean, it sounds so ridiculous for a guy to be like, I love Rome, the Roman Empire. It's cliche at this point. So I don't love the Roman Empire. I love Pompeii specifically. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. It is, a lot of people have forgotten about it. If you're not in France or England, it's kind of like not, it was, but it was such a bloody and awful day in history that it really provided a great opportunity for the story to get dark in a way that I felt like, we're 3/4 of the way through the book. We need something to scare the boys and something to really ratchet up the drama. And so I put them in one of the most awful, awful days of human history. But in terms of the chapters that were the most fun to write, I'd say were London and Greenland. I'm a huge Anglophile too. I mean, I also grew up watching Doctor Who.
Right.
And Doctor Who did an episode about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which is the only reason I know about it. So shout out to an episode of Doctor Who from the 1960s, still influencing contemporary writers 60 years later. But I think the London chapter was a lot of fun to write, because unlike the other chapters, even though it's taking place in the middle of a bombing, it's fun for them. It's like 95% fun. It's shenanigans. It's them. It's two boys getting into trouble, having fun. The stakes are not that high until the very, very end. And so you get to see the boys having fun and being sneaky, and
yes,
as opposed to whereas in the others' past lives, the jeopardy is sort of almost immediate of the danger they're in. So the London chapter was a lot of fun to write. And The Viking chapter was also a lot of fun to write because it's the one chapter not specifically based on a historical tragedy or a historical event, even though it's taken from an Icelandic folklore. And obviously Eric the Red was real, and his settlement in Greenland was real. And so I sort of combined Eric the Red's history with this Icelandic folklore about the little Cirrus, who in my book I call Ulthild. And because that was not based on an actual historical event like the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, I had a lot more freedom in that chapter to do to take it in different directions. Mm-hmm. And I got to tell a slightly spookier story because I get to introduce Cirruses and witchcraft, and the magical element sort of comes into the book in that chapter and sort of paves the way for what comes after in the present day. So that was when I realized I could use the Viking chapter to then influence the rest of the last 3/4 of the novel. I was like, oh, that's fun. That's a nice connection that'll have a great payoff.
Yes, I agree with you. All right, so I am very fond of asking goofy questions. So
I love goofy questions. They're my favorite questions.
Good. So what do you have against tomatoes, really?
so I think the line in the book is that Riley inherited his hatred of tomatoes from his father. I inherited my hatred of tomatoes from my mother, which is funny because we're Italian.
Oh my goodness! Yes, that's almost blasphemous, right
there. Love tomato sauce. We love, but natural raw tomatoes, they taste like balls of water to us. It's like how some people with cilantro, they say it tastes like soap.
Yeah,
tomatoes taste like disgusting bags of water to my mother, to me.
Well, I can almost agree with you. I like raw tomatoes, but the one thing I can't stand that makes me have the heebie-jeebies is a tomato sandwich. And my mother and father loved those in the summer, and they just, when I would see the mayonnaise and the tomato sneaking through the white bread, I was like, oh, I was so disgusted because I don't know. I had very finicky ways as a child, for
Same.
sure. So, all right. So now my second goofy question is, do you like roller coasters?
No.
I had a feeling that was going to be the answer. But I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure because, it was a great device to use the roller coaster.
Thank you. Yes, I'm not like a thrill seeker like that. I don't even like plane turbulence. So I'm not a thrill seeker. So yes, I didn't even think about that now. My own hatred of roller coasters is what.
Well, the tomato was a little more obvious, but the roller coaster could have gone either way, really. It truly could have. So I am an adrenaline junkie by far. I will ride anything there is to ride, but I'm also a math nerd. So I sit and do mathematical equations on if this jumps the track, how many people are going to die before me to help with my impact. And so a couple of years ago, I was at a theme park in Sandusky, Ohio, and one of my friends wanted to ride one more time, but he only wanted to sit in the front car. I had never sat in the front car. I will probably never, ever sit in the front car again, because then my mathematical formulas only screwed me more, because I realized I was going to be the people behind me's impact.
You were going to be the buffer, yeah.
I was going to be the buffer, and I all of a sudden I didn't particularly care for that mathematics any longer. I'm like, yeah, I don't like that at all.
Yeah, it's having grown up in Florida and having gone to Disney like more times than I can count. I've ridden all the roller coasters there. And my original intention was to set the final chapters of my book at Disney. But considering what happens, in the book, I assumed Disney would not be happy.
Well, I agree with you. Yes. And the last thing, sometimes the controversy helps book sales, but if they sued you, they have a very large legal team, and that would not be fun. So
I was like, let's not set the book at Disney. Let's make up a theme park. So
when I first moved to Florida in 1988, there was a theme park on the west coast of Florida somewhere close around Clearwater, and it was much, much, much smaller one. It wasn't even like a Six Flags or whatever. It was a family-owned theme park that didn't last for very long because they're very expensive to operate. But I remember I met a guy that had worked there, and he was telling me about it. And I thought, I don't necessarily think I'd want to go where there's just mom and pop running the place because, sometimes mom and pop have to cut corners, which is understandable. But I'm like, I'd rather have a big corporation behind my roller coaster ride, I think. So I noticed in a lot of the chapters in the different time frames, we always had a support person. And I think in Orlando, we had Aunt Rachel. And I liked that support person because in France, it's the inn owner. At least that's what I gathered from it. So how important in your life has that support person been to you? Because I'm assuming, big assumption here, that at some point in your life, you had an older person who was maybe a mentor. Is that right? Or were you your own mentor?
I don't, that's, that's a really good question. I can't think of someone off the top of my head who served as in writing. Absolutely. I absolutely had writing mentors. Yes. Okay. Yes. Like my college dramatic writing professor, I've, people like that. Absolutely. In terms of like my development as a queer person in the world, I would say no, I don't think or in terms of like, I don't think I've had a person like that in my life. Maybe that's why I created Aunt Rachel and Riley's father, because I wanted to believe people like that exist.
Absolutely. I will say that I had the same experience you had, Kevin, growing up. I don't feel like I had that mentor as far as my queer development went. But I remember when I did first move to Miami, I met this succession of strong women that really influenced my development as a human being, because for the first time in my life, I was very far away from my parents. And I felt like the universe kept bringing someone to me to show me sort of a motherly influence while not trying to be my mom, which I found. So that's why I really resonated so well with Aunt Rachel, because I thought, well, God bless anyone who does get that in life. I got it, not in my queer development, but in other parts of my development as a young adult, I did get that. So I really did identify very well with her.
Yeah. And I think as I grow older and age into the, uncle or position in people's lives, like I feel like Aunt Rachel and Riley's dad are sort of templates of how I hope I will behave and respond to the next generation of queer youth coming up in the world. So yeah, that's kind of.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, they were wonderful role models. And I do think that, as you said really early in the podcast, that, we can't just show the queer joy, because there are still hardships in life for everyone, not just queer people, but we all have a road to navigate down. And if I can give back to someone or help someone along the way, I'm always happy to do it, because it does make life a lot sweeter. I get blessed in return, so I'm happy with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, once again, the book is Don't Let Me Go. It's by Kevin Snipes. It is so amazing, Kevin. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com, on Twitter at outwithdan, and on Instagram and Facebook at Go Out with Dan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.